Our Bible word is Matthew 16, verses 15 to 16. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So this is the account in Matthew where Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ, the Messiah, and they are in the region of Caesarea Philippi. And just to give some background to this, there was Herod the Great, who was the king of the Jews. And if we look at this map, we can see the thick black outline. That was his kingdom. And when he died, his kingdom was divided amongst three of his sons. The first was Archelaus, who was made the ethnarch of Judea and Samaria. And then Herod Antipas, he was made ruler or tetrarch over Galilee. And there was also another brother, Philip, and his area was to the north and east of Galilee. And the gospel says that Jesus and his disciples were in the region of Caesarea Philippi. So they're situated north of Galilee. And Philip, he followed in the tradition of his father by renaming cities in honor of the Roman emperor. If we look at this map of Galilee, over here we can see Caesarea on the coast. This is where Herod the Great, he built the city and made a big harbor here, and he named it after Caesar Augustus. And Herod Antipas, he also built a brand new city and he called it Tiberias, after the emperor Tiberius. And yes, Caesarea Philippi, this is where Philip, he renamed the city in 14 AD as Caesarea. It was originally called Paneas, but it's called Caesarea Philippi to distinguish it from the Caesarea on the coast. So Caesarea Philippi in a sense means Philip's Caesarea. Also, he renamed this city Bethsaida as Julius, probably in the honor of the wife of Augustus, Bethsaida Julius. And so we can see here that Herod the Great and his sons, they renamed cities after the Roman emperors to ingratiate themselves to the Roman emperors. Of course, this would have made the people living in Galilee, the Jews, etc., would have infuriated them. Because Herod the Great here, in this Caesarea on the coast, he even built a temple dedicated to Augustus, because the emperor was also regarded as divine in a degree. So you can imagine what the influence this had. But this is the setting for our current pericope that we're dealing with. So Jesus and his disciples, they were in the region here of Caesarea Philippi, and then he asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So the Son of Man was a title that the Gospels apply to Jesus. The meaning, it varies depending on the context. Normally it would just be a means to say I or me, or it can refer to any human being. In the Gospels it refers to Jesus, that he's this divine being. He's the ruler of the cosmos, and this is derived from the language that we find in Daniel. The Son of Man who comes to the Ancient of Days and is given universal rule. So the Son of Man figure in the Gospels refers to Jesus. He will be this cosmic ruler. He will be given rule and authority over everything. And he will also be a judge and a deliverer. So this is also what the Son of Man means here. So it can in a sense mean, Jesus say, who do the people say I am? But also from a theological perspective, the Gospels also saying, who do the people say the Son of Man? In other words, this cosmic, this ruler over all, this deliverer figure. Who do the people say he is? So now comes the response. It says, some say you are John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Now, Herod Antipas, already earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, if you go read chapter 14 verses 2, when he hears of Jesus, he says, this is John the Baptist who has been raised from the dead. Others say it's maybe Elijah, Jesus, because the story in the 2 Kings, if you go to 2 Kings 2 verse 11, Elijah was taken up in a fiery chariot. And also in Malachi 4 verses 25, it's actually said Elijah will come back. So some says, this is Elijah. Jesus is Elijah. Others says, well, he's one of the prophets like Jeremiah or somebody else. So obviously people were speculating, who is Jesus? Maybe it's John the Baptist. Maybe he's Elijah. Maybe he's Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. Then of course Jesus speaks to his disciples and says, okay, who do you say that I am? And now comes Peter's confession. He said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. We must also note that in Gospel of Matthew, Peter plays a prominent role. He plays a prominent role in the other Gospels also, but specifically in the Gospel of Matthew. There's more events that happened around Peter that's related. And this all begins already at 14 verses 28, where there was a storm at sea and Jesus was walking on the water. And of course the disciples were afraid and whatever, but Jesus said, don't be afraid, it's me. And then Peter asked him, can I also walk on the water? And then Jesus says, come. And of course we know the story. Peter started walking on the water and then he started to sink. Also, if you go to chapter 17, there's a story where people come to Jesus, or they ask Peter, doesn't your master pay the temple tax? Then Jesus tells him, go to the sea, you will catch a fish. There will be a coin and you can use it to pay for us. There's also in 18 verses 21 to 22, the story of how many times must I forgive? Peter asks. If you read the parallel account in Luke 17, it's Jesus just gives teaching, you must forgive 70 times 7. But here in Matthew, it's the words or the question is put on the lips of Peter, how many times must I forgive? 7 times? Then there Jesus tells him, no, 70 times 7 times. And here also in our current textual unit, Peter receives prominence. Because after his confession, based on his confession, Jesus gives him a special task, a future task for him. And there's another thing that's going on here in the Gospel of Matthew. It's about the church. The disciples will become the future leaders of the church. It's only in the Gospel of Matthew where there is this concern for the church as such, because it's only here where the term church, or the Greek ecclesia, it means assembly, is actually mentioned by Jesus. And that occurs here in chapter 16 verse 18, and also in chapter 18 verse 17, where Jesus specifically or explicitly makes mention of the church. So for Matthew, the church is important, and the future leadership roles of the apostles is also important for him. And here we get a bit of that, because here we have Peter's confession, and now Jesus tells him, you are going to play an important role in this church. Because Jesus also tells him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So this was a divine revelation that was given to Peter. Now, because he had this insight into the identity of Jesus, this is the first explicit identification of Jesus by the disciples in the gospel. Now Jesus tells him, and I also say to you that you are Peter. Now the word in Greek is Petros, and it means rock. So we can also paraphrase it, and I also say to you that you are rock. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. So Peter, also based on his confession, He will be the bedrock on which Jesus will build his church, his assembly, his ecclesia in Greek, based on this confession, based on this knowledge that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And also, the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. So, Hades, it refers to the realm of the dead. So, Jesus is saying here that the realm of the dead, who holds the souls captive, it will not prevail against the church. In other words, the church will conquer it. Hades is like a city. It's got high walls. It's got gates, etc. But the church is like an army that will come against it. It will overpower Hades, and it will open the gates, and it will make the captives free. So part of the mission of the church, and that Jesus gives it, is that it will conquer Hades. It will overcome Hades. It will set the dead free. So that's part of this new task for Peter and the church that Jesus gives. And Jesus goes further. He also tells Peter, "And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." In other words, Jesus will give Peter the responsibility for the church, which is also used here, the kingdom of heaven. If you give somebody the keys to your house, they go away on holiday maybe, and they say, "Here's my keys, look after my house, feed my dogs," etc. It's you giving that person control and authority, to stewardship of it while you're away, to look after it, to make sure that it's kept clean, to make sure that nobody breaks in, that the right thing happens, etc. So by giving Peter the keys, Jesus is giving him stewardship of the church, authority of the church, management of the church. It must be run well. And particularly important here also is how to interpret the law. Remember, there are two groups that it's relevant here for Matthew. There's the Jewish Christians under Jesus, under the apostles, under the Christian scribes, that is the church, and they are opposed against those who do not believe in Jesus, the other Pharisees and the other scribes and the sages, etc., that would attend the synagogue. Because there was this power struggle at this time. Who are the true leaders of Israel? Who are the true teachers of Israel? And Matthew says it's Jesus, he's the new Moses. It's through the apostles, specifically here Peter. He's the bedrock of this new community, the church. And of course also the author of this gospel as a Christian scribe who teach and interpret the law. And this is what goes on to say in verse 19. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. In other words, what you do not permit, it will not permitted in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. In other words, what you do permit here in the church amongst God's people, will be permitted in heaven. In other words, it's how to apply the law. For example, binding, where Jesus gives an example, is you can't look at a woman because then you've already committed adultery. That's an example of making the law strict. But loosening, Jesus says, you can heal on the Sabbath. It's not work, it's doing good. So those are examples of binding and loosing. It means to permit something or to not permit it. It must not happen. So this is Jesus. He's now giving authority to Peter. He's the bedrock. He will be the steward of the church to look after it. Also, he will have keys. He will also have the authority to bind and to loose. And Jesus gives us authority also to the rest of the apostles. If we go to chapter 18, verse 18, this authority to bind and loose is given to the rest of the apostles, to a degree also to the church. It's telling them, you are the true interpreters of the law. You are the true teachers and leaders of Israel. The other Pharisees, the other scribes in their synagogues where they come together, The true interpretation of the law is not found there. You have been given authority to bind and loose. And specifically here around Peter. So Peter receives special prominence in Matthew. He is the rock. His name means rock. And on this rock, Jesus will build his church. He will have stewardship of the church. He will also have authority to bind and to loose, to permit things that people can do or to forbid it, that people cannot do this. So essential here is that the author is concerned about the future leadership of the church. And Jesus transfers his leadership to Peter, to the other apostles, and of course in that tradition, as a Christian scribe, him as the author of this gospel and others of this Christian community, they see themselves as the true leaders of God's people.